We will go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our next IRA bootcamp session. This is another one of our combined sessions. We have folks from both our HFA cohort and our owner and developer cohort on the line, and we'll be focusing on ways that owners and agencies can engage in center residents, specifically in their IRA work. So before we get started on that topic, we have a few bootcamp and IRA program updates. And then from there, we will hear from Sunshine, who is the executive director at Piedmont Housing, about some resident engagement work he's been leading at a property in Charlottesville. And then afterwards from Luke Tate and Phil Cunningham from Virginia Housing about some resident engagement work that they've been supporting in Virginia and how they're starting to look at IRA. And then we'll touch on briefly a NHT project that we're working on around equitable electrification at some of our DC properties. And then we have our final few sessions scheduled, so we'll go over those at the end. So next steps for our technical assistance for our owner cohort. So for those of you that submitted your property data for the September deadline, New Ecology is finalizing those scopes of work now, and we're going to start scheduling the cohort sessions in mid-November, ending before people go on break for Thanksgiving. These cohort sessions are not just for bootcamp developers who submitted for this round of TA. It's open for everybody in the developer cohort because we want to make sure that you're all given the opportunity to kind of see what others in your region or in your state are doing and what potential work you could do at your properties. For those that did not submit in September, we are starting a second round of TA with a deadline in January. So I should have reached out to all of you. We've either already chatted or we're going to be chatting later this week. But if you haven't heard from me and you didn't submit the first round and want to receive TA, feel free to reach out to me after this and we can get something scheduled. And then I'll pass it over to Danielle, who will talk a bit about our in-person HFA session the other week.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Madeline. I'm really excited to be here today, especially on a joint session. And we also had the good pleasure about 10 days ago of being in Boston with several of our HFA participants in person. So about 8 or 9 HFAs were able to join us in the room. We had a couple hours set aside to really talk about whatever folks would find value in talking about. And it was a really helpful time together. I think it was a good chance to kind of remind ourselves of some of the similar challenges that HFAs are confronting, and the questions that have been answered and the questions that we need to answer. So among some of the highlights that we wanted to share with you all was a lot of discussion around the Solar for All program, which you all know now is one of the EPA Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund programs that's coming down. We learned that about half of the HFAs have had some role in their Solar for All application. Would love to hear in the chat if you've had a role, if you've had a hand or a participant in your state's application. In many cases, that's been a really good way to forge some of those connections with state energy offices that we've talked about. We also talked about, though, a lot of the persistent challenges around the rebates and frankly, just general capacity constraints, both on the side of the HFAs, many of whom are struggling to find the right staff person to lead this work, having to pivot from existing roles to do more or frankly hire new people on. And I'll say I think that's a common thread that we've heard from our developers as well, many of whom are on the call, that just the importance of getting the right staff in the right position is so critical at this time. We talked a little bit about how consultants and developing some RFPs could be helpful, maybe sharing job descriptions amongst HFAs could be useful in addressing some of those capacity constraints. And we talked about maybe starting up a working group to support HFAs as the rebates roll out across states, knowing that that's going to take a good amount of time and still, persistent attention to make sure that we can navigate those relationships with your state energy office. In terms of, maybe some challenges that are shared both by HFAs, certainly that we heard, but also that probably challenges that are felt by developers too, is a challenge around how to communicate about the programs that are being offered. There's so many resources. It's very complex information. At the same time, people make stuff in bite-sized chunks. So how do you find that sweet spot? To effectively, from the HFA perspective, communicate to owners. You all owners on the call are already informed, but for those who aren't part of this program, how do HFAs communicate with those owners about the opportunities? So out of that, we discussed some draft copy and paste resources that we're working on that would be pivoted or be designed so that an HFA could quickly use that resource, put it on their social media, put it in an email, get the word out to their owners. So we've got some great feedback on those at the meeting. We'll be finalizing resources for DOE, Treasury, Treasury programs, the greenhouse gas reduction programs out of EPA, and the Green and Resilient Retrofit program from HUD, as well as a resource around stacking. How do all these things stack together? We hope to have that ready by the end of the month. And then just, continued information on how we, or continued challenges around how we sort of ensure that we can share that, particularly through the programs that require the sharing of benefits with tenants and maximizing renewable energy. How do we do that in ways that really work in multifamily affordable housing? So those were some of the sort of discussion points. It was great to have the time with folks. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just now seeing the audio problems. I hope that people found value in coming together, and we'll be sharing all those resources with the whole group shortly. Thank you. Oh, I think I'm turning it. Oh, never mind. Back to Madeline.
Thanks, Danielle. So last week, HUD released their first round of Leading Edge Awards through the GRP program. So Leading Edge is what supports developers looking to receive an advanced green building certification. It's one of the 3 cohorts through the program. They awarded about 25%, about a quarter of the funding in the first round, a little over $103 million. You can see here on the right the list of states that received awards and how many awards went to each state. NHT's real estate development team received one of the Virginia awards for property in Fredericksburg, so we're looking forward to doing work there. And then this is just a quick overview of the GRP funding status and where we're at with some upcoming deadlines. I know some of our developers are looking to hit the October 31st or November 30th deadlines. We should be hearing regarding second and first round awards for elements and comprehensive awards. Elements is kind of like those details that go along with a recapitalization project, like specific system upgrades, whereas comprehensive is more deep retrofit, whole building work. So once those are released, we'll make sure to share that with you all. A few other updates in terms of IRS and DOE programs. So for those of you that don't know, the low income communities bonus tax credit through IRS is 10% or 20% point increases for wind or solar facilities. So if you're installing a facility on a low income community or on Indian land, you can get a 10% increase. And then if you're installing on, or you're part of a qualified low income residential building or economic benefit project, you can get 20%. So what's important here, and the big update, is that DOE began accepting applications last week for the credits. Applications submitted within the first 30 days will be treated as being received on the same day. And then it's a rolling submission for the rest of the applications, either through the end of the year or early 2024, to ensure that all 4 categories receive their allocated credits. When we send out the slide deck later this week, you can look at the links to the application portal and additional information. And then in terms of DOE rebates, on October 13th, DOE released additional guidance for program administrators with some key clarification and updates. They will now allow energy efficiency retrofits that were initiated on or after August 16th of last year to qualify for the home efficiency rebate. Previous guidance did not allow for the rebates to be applied retroactively to retrofits completed before states launch their programs. We do expect that some states will have to decide whether or not they want to implement this option. And it only applies to the energy efficiency rebates, not to the home electrification and appliance rebates. DOE also clarified a clerical error in their calculation of the required minimum income and low income for multifamily allocations. So they clarified that nationwide, at least $2.7 billion must be used in rebates for low income households, and an additional $665 million for low income multifamily households. So this is an increase from $2 billion for low income households and an increase of $500 million for low income multifamily households. That was originally published in DOE's original guidance. And just a reminder that state energy offices can apply for up to 2.5% of their allocation in early administration funds now. This has been going on since the spring. And this funding can be used to support administrative costs such as capacity building, strategic planning, workforce analysis, coordination across programs, and consumer outreach. And I'll pass it back over to Danielle.
Thanks, and hopefully the audio is a little better this time. So part of the reason that we wanted to spend today focusing on resident engagement is because we do know and see in many of the programs that resident engagement is very much incentivized in IRA programs. As you heard from Madeline, there are bonuses in programs when those are allocated to communities that fit a particular characteristic, whether it's a by income or disinvested, underinvested. Through the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative, there's a lot of importance being placed on engaging low-income and disadvantaged communities as recipients of these climate change funds. And for that reason, it becomes really important that we ensure that we're centering our work in their needs, and that principle kind of carries through a lot of the IRA programs. So the slides here kind of demonstrate a little bit of how some of those programs speak to resident engagement, which is why we wanted to bring some practitioners here today, both from the owner and the HFA side, to talk about what they're doing, and perhaps invite you all to contribute your ideas as well. The HUD and Green Resilient Retrofit Program and the Low Income Bonus Credit Program both require owners to consult with residents. For example, building owners receiving GRP awards, like NHT and like Sunshine's group you'll hear about in a second, have to be engaging residents at various stages of the retrofit process. There are also examples of requirements for program administrators to engage low-income and disadvantaged communities when you're setting up the program design and the operations of those programs. That requirement is clear in the home energy rebates and the Solar for All programs. So with all of that as a backdrop, our goal really here is to give examples of successful strategies for resident community engagement to both support you in accessing IRA resources, whether you're a building owner seeking to use these dollars or whether you're an HFA involved in designing and implementing programs. So we've teed up some ideas from a couple partners here, one of whom has been a stalwart partner to NHT for many years. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sunshine Mathon, who's Executive Director for Piedmont Housing Alliance. Sunshine, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me all right? Great. And Danielle, he'll keep me on track in terms of timing here. So if I go over, let me know. But I'm going to speak about Friendship Court, actually recently renamed to Kindlewood, a project-based Section 8 community that we have been an ownership partner in since 2001, actually in partnership with NHT. And let's go to the next slide, actually. I'm going to start there. So, thank you. So like many, almost every city across the country and many regions outside of cities, this location of where Friendship Court was located, ultimately built, was the site of urban renewal devastation of an existing Black community in Charlottesville. So prior to 1978, it was actually a thriving Black neighborhood with businesses and homes, both rental and home ownership. And during urban renewal, although Charlottesville didn't have any highways cutting through it, under the guise of public safety and health, the city decided to decimate this region as well as a few others, Black neighborhoods in Charlottesville. And it really has had a tremendous long-term impact on opportunities for upward economic mobility for Black households in Charlottesville, and really eviscerated the Black middle class here. In 1978, Friendship Court was built by a private owner, and that during that time, HUD, basically allocated project-based Section 8 communities and had capital resources to build it, as well as the operational funding. And it was we didn't have any relationship with the original building organization or the original developer. But in 2001, 2002, it was at risk for being lost in the city as what had become really critical, deeply affordable housing in the heart of the city. It's 2 blocks south of the downtown mall and just about a mile east of UVA, the flagship university in the state. And fundamentally, these 150 apartments had really become home, both in short-term and long-term, for hundreds of families, and really had the city did not want to see it lost. So they reached out to Piedmont Housing, and this predates me and my time, but reached out to Piedmont Housing, and in partnership with NHT came together to acquire it, to preserve it over the long run. And then in the 2016 timeframe, the idea of redeveloping Friendship Court emerged. And initially it came from the developer side, Piedmont Housing, and I joined in 2017. So I came in about a year or so after the process had begun. Next slide, please. But that process was in engaging with the residents. There were a few key threads that emerged out of the resident engagement and community engagement. And I'm not going to go into details for every one of these. Sometimes I do 2-hour versions of this presentation, which is not what we're going to see today. So I'm not really going to touch on each of these details, but leave it to say that fundamentally the residents were supportive or skeptically supportive of the idea of redevelopment, as long as they were at the table and that their aspirations in particular were going to be addressed. Next slide. And one of the most important decisions that happened at the outset of that planning process was the establishment of this advisory committee, and the 9 residents you see there on the top of the screen were actually elected by their neighbors from within the community, within the 150 apartments, and they were basically elected to say, we want you to represent us through this planning process. And we have been working with them ever since. And part of the one key layer that I want to highlight is that our engagement with them is not relying on them to only volunteer their time. So throughout this entire process, we have been engaging with them as if they, which they truly are co-designers of their future neighborhood. So that means they bring expertise to the table. They're not just bringing their volunteer hours to this. They're bringing their expertise, and we recognize they need to be compensated accordingly. So for every meeting we have, and we average on, basically for the last 7 years, we've averaged probably about 1 meeting a month. And where we meet for 2 hours, they get a substantial stipend, 1, to cover that time, but 2, to also recognize that they do spend time beyond those meetings in the community, listening to their neighbors, sharing ideas, and we kind of that cross-fertilization that happens. But that's one of the reasons why those folks have stayed so engaged. We've had a little bit of turnover, and so, for example, Taekwon there in the yellow hat, he looks young there, but he's now in college. It's been a little while since we began this process, but he has moved on, and we've gotten some new youth members. But most of the folks you see here have stayed engaged that entire time, which is pretty remarkable. And additionally, we had some key at-large community members also part of that committee. On the left is Kathy Galvin. She is at the time she was a city councilor, now a former city councilor. And Miss Houchins there in the second, just to the right of Kathy, is a former resident and ultimately became a homeowner, and she's a school teacher in the local school system, although she recently retired. And she brings in sort of her longevity of experience both in and outside of the community. And then on the far right is actually Kevin White from NHT. He was a partner throughout this as well. So there's been a little bit of movement in terms of the representation here, but the common thread is that the residents in particular were always centered in the decision-making process. And fundamentally, every major decision and almost all minor ones were engaged with the residents in one way or another. Next slide, please. And in order for them to be fully engaged, and in particular, when we're talking about the redevelopment of a 12-acre master block, which is how the site was originally designed, that community is its location just south of the downtown mall. It's actually a really important location citywide in terms of how the downtown sort of pivots and grows over time. So we recognize that the design process that was taking place had residents at the table and absolutely needed to center the resident aspirations, but we also needed to make sure that as they were engaging holistically, that they were thinking about the surrounding neighborhoods, about connections to other parts of the city, about public space, how all these things came together. And so in order for that engagement to be authentic, we actually went through a long series of charrettes and meetings with them to really build capacity, so that when it came time for them to make decisions, that they were informed and could be able to not just say, I want version A versus version B, but to actually be authentically engaged in the developing of what those options were in the first place. Next slide, please. And so you can see on the left-hand side here the existing 150 apartments, and you can see the sort of master block design, which essentially is all the interior parking is on interior parking lots, and in fact, all the back doors of the units face the streets surrounding. So all the front doors face interior, which is holistically different from any surrounding neighborhood and any neighborhood that we would typically want to live in. We want you want to be be able to walk out the front door onto your sidewalk or your street or your park or your driveway that then goes onto the street. That was not how this was designed originally. It was designed as this master block that essentially isolated both sort of psychologically and physically from the rest of the city. One of the core value that the residents wanted to ensure is that if redevelopment was going to happen, one, it had fundamentally it had to have zero displacement throughout the process. And we were fortunate to have on the right-hand side where you see the rendered part, that was open green space. And it was largely open green space, not because they would planned it that way from a beneficial perspective, but there's actually an underground channelized urban creek that runs under that section, and they didn't want to build over it, understandably. And it carries the stormwater from all of downtown and much of north of Charlottesville. So as we were going through the process of deciding how we could develop in a way that has zero displacement, we knew we had to build in this open space first. And then when that is open, you'll see the sort of boundary there around what it says 46 existing families move. When phase one is complete, those 46 families will move in. And in fact, about half of those have already moved in. We just opened up the 2 building clusters on the lower right-hand corner, which are townhomes. And then the multifamily building in purple above will open at the end of this year. So that's phasing. And then next slide, please. Will show that once those buildings are empty, then we can build into phase 2, and then the 54 existing families in that other section will be able to move into phase 2. And then next slide. The last 50 families will be able to move into phase 3. And one of the a number of other key goals emerged for the residents that I'll just quickly list. One is that they wanted to ensure that each phase was, even though it's part of a puzzle of the whole, that fundamentally it is also can stand alone on its own right, because we're doing this in sequence. Each phase is 2 years in process. So they didn't want there to be waiting for the open space. They didn't want to be waiting for other opportunities. It had to all kind of work in sequence. So each phase has a combination of townhomes and multifamily. Each phase has open space and playgrounds and a basketball court or some version of that. And then also one key piece is that each phase also has some direct community investment that goes beyond just housing. So in phase 1, where you see that orangish elongated rectangle, that actually is going to be a commercial building on the ground floor, which will be a new high quality early learning center. The middle floor, the second floor, will be a new replacement community center that will provide after school programming and adult focused programming as well. And then actually Piedmont Housing will move its permanent headquarters to the top floor. And so we can be directly there and accountable to the community as a whole. And then one other really key piece that emerged out of the process, which was unexpected but really wonderful, is that you'll see that future 1 acre park in the center, which is sort of a bringing together of pieces in phases 2 and 3. That future park will obviously be at the heart of the community, but it will actually become deeded over to the city and become a public park operated by the city when it's complete. The last thing I'll highlight is that the residents knew that in addition to replacing existing 150 apartments, they wanted to ensure that there were new affordable housing being built as well, and at different income tiers. So by the time we are done, we will have built somewhere between 400 and 450 homes, 150 replacement units, another roughly 150 at the sort of 30 to 60% AMI band, another 150 at the 60 to 80% AMI band. And those tiers and that ratio was very, very intentional. The idea being that residents wanted to have a way for them to grow their incomes without having to move out of their community, to be able to stay in place as they grew. And then also to provide additional affordable housing in a prime location in the heart of Charlottesville. Next slide. And then you'll see on the upper left-hand corner of phase 4 of big giant gray square there. That is yet to be designed. We've been focused on the first 3 phases, which is where everyone will be rehoused. And we'll get to that phase 4 design here shortly, probably in the next year or so. It will also have some additional affordable housing, but we also are looking at the idea of affordable home ownership in that scenario, maybe in a limited equity co-op model or something along those lines. And then that is also the closest to the commercial core of the city. So ground floor retail and commercial spaces are likely to be part of that too. Next slide. These are just a couple of renderings of some of the townhomes along that we just opened up, but we don't have the actual photos. I don't have recent photos quite yet. And then the next one is the multifamily building off of Garrett Street, which is these are all renderings from phase 1. So these will be, transformations of the existing community, which is, 45 years old. Not that is necessarily a measure of buildings that should be torn down, but they were built poorly in the first place. They were not designed well, and they were designed to exclude. And then I think there's one more image. One more slide. And this is the future community center and early learning center that will be at the heart of phase 1 as well. All right, so that we can take the slides down now. And so the couple of key points that I want to highlight, and then I think my 15 minutes are up. One is that our housing finance agency, Virginia Housing, was pivotal in us being able to start that process. So we actually got a pre-development grant from Virginia Housing. At the time, it was the largest planning grant that was ever provided. I think it was $250,000, and that was crucial for us to be able to grow our capacity, pay the residents for their time, work with an architect, go through the whole process to make sure that what we ultimately were going to design with the residents was, 1, feasible, and 2, truly reflected the residents' aspirations. So the Virginia Housing has played a pivotal role from the very beginning, and then throughout as a financing partner in terms of lending, in terms of what Virginia Housing calls reach dollars, which is sort of helping subsidize and buy down interest rates on permanent financing, low-income housing tax credits. Like HFA has been a huge partner in helping us realize this. And I think that one of the really interesting outcomes of this process is that by going through this process, which is longer and frankly a little bit slower than your traditional process for picking a site, designing it, and then moving forward without necessarily resident input. Although it's longer, the result is actually sort of a masterpiece of urban planning, frankly, given what it does for the surrounding neighborhood as well. And it was designed by residents effectively. And that does take longer. It takes investment. It takes commitment. It also means that every few months we would make some mistake in our relationship with them, and we'd have to clean that up and rebuild and recommit. And that process of showing up over and over and over again and restating and recentering residents has been pivotal to us finding the resources, financial resources, frankly. The city has committed unprecedented amounts of money to help support the project and close gaps. Virginia Housing has been a huge supporter, as I mentioned. We just recently got one of those 2 Virginia GRRP grants came to this project for phase 2, the next phase that we're about to start. Though a lot of those resources are coming to us in part because they see the demonstrated model of resident engagement and resident-led design. And so there is, even though there's some initial investment, there is, in my opinion, both like the financial payoff and then frankly the ethical payoff of the residents having their community be theirs that they work through. All right, I'm going to pause there.
That's perfect, Sunshine. Thank you. And right on time. Amazing. One quick question before we transition to the Virginia Housing folks. Could you just extrapolate a little bit on some of the insights that you gained through the resident engagement process that informed the project phase that ultimately won the GRRP awards? Are there specific ideas or elements that came out through that process that you intentionally kind of baked into that phase that you think might have been and are now being able to be funded because of that backstory?
Honestly, I'd have
foundation?
a hard time not talking about anything. Like the residents had their fingers in the pot on every single one of those pieces. So, and where we ended up as a design process, both in phase 2 specifically, but more broadly for how the whole site interacts and comes together, there is no way we would have designed the site that way. There was actually a first version that was done without resident input. This is again before my time, just to sort of like look at a capacity study, look at the way it could re-knit back in the neighborhood, and where we ended up in the long run after the truly engaged resident design process. Yes, there were some common threads, but overall, it is a far better plan from an urban planning perspective, let alone anything else, because of the resident insights around, safety and the kids, and how the road infrastructure integrated and wove through the site, the balance point between open space, parking typologies, and housing types. The original plan showed maybe 600 units instead of 450, but the residents pushed back on that because they wanted to have some integrity of their existing neighborhood or their sense of neighborhood. There were so many things that they touched on and really made an impact on. And one of the things they highlighted is the desire to have the housing being some of the most energy efficient and frankly solar powered housing in the Commonwealth. And we were glad to be partners with them on that as well. Does that help, Danielle?
It totally does. Yeah, especially the sort of desire around the sustainability of it.
Yep.
I'm imagining, but not assuming, part of that is cost driven, right? That they want to be able to save money, but part of it must be like we want to be able to showcase our houses as a leader to housing more generally.
Yeah, I will say the primary entry point of that conversation was around utility costs and utility savings. Like fundamentally, what is real and present for folks is their budget and their day to day. And so that was the entry into the conversation. But once you enter the conversation, then it does allow for an expansion of the vision and what impact it can have more broadly.
Totally. That makes perfect sense. Thank you. I think we're turning over to Virginia Housing now, right? Madeline, do you want to introduce our next guest? Thank you, Sunshine.
Yes, thanks. Awesome. So now we're going to hear from Luke Tate and Phil Cunningham at Virginia Housing. They're going to talk through some of what Sunshine mentioned about what Virginia Housing is doing now to support developers in their efforts to engage residents and their community, and how they're looking to continue this work through IRA programming. So Luke and Phil, I'll pass it over to you.
All right, thank you. Can you all hear me well? All right, great. So my name's Luke Tate. As you saw on the slide just before, I will just say that Piedmont Housing Alliance is also one of our key partners in a place where housing affordability is really at the forefront of what localities are seeing. So it was great to hear from Sunshine. Next slide. So just a little bit about Virginia Housing. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary last year, and our mission here is, like most other HFAs, to help Virginians attain quality, affordable housing. And so we do that through a variety of ways, through multifamily financing, as you just heard, through mortgages for first-time home buyers. And then I work specifically in the community outreach division, where we engage with what we call the Affordable Housing Delivery Network through a variety of grant programs, which I'll talk about in just a minute. We are not the state HUD participating jurisdiction. So our sister agency, the Department of Housing and Community Development, is the recipient of HUD funding for the Home and National Housing Trust Fund, and they have a state housing trust fund that they also administer. Next slide. So in community outreach, and specifically on the team that I work on, the strategic housing team, we are really oftentimes the first contact that an external partner has with Virginia Housing. We are attending conferences, stakeholder meetings, housing summits, And we have some focus areas specifically on the strategic housing team around economic development, equitable development, underserved markets, and local government, and then rental housing. So we connect, potential partners with rental lending or with home ownership if that's what they are looking to do. And then if we cannot necessarily assist them here at Virginia Housing, we'll connect them with other partners like DHCD. Next slide, please. So Sunshine mentioned REACH, which is a resource that we have internally generated here. We reinvest a portion of our net revenues through the REACH program. And so it touches all three divisions of the authority: homeownership, rental, and community outreach. And on the next slide, just a couple of examples that you will see. So Sunshine mentioned the loan subsidies through the REACH program. That is for affordable projects, but also specifically for rural and supportive housing projects. We provide grants to the Housing Counseling Network, and then grant programs like our Community Impact Grant, which I'll talk about in just a second, help with revitalization and planning aspects for both regional informative tasks, but also for due diligence for specific projects. The REACH program also helps with down payment assistance, and then we have a program called Spark, which organizations can apply for an allocation of Spark funding that will reduce the interest rate by 1% from our first-time home buyer rate to help, support home ownership. Along with the kind of loan subsidy, we support permanent supportive housing, as I just mentioned. And then the last thing, we have some capacity building grants here at Virginia Housing that can support nonprofits and housing authorities with strategic planning or succession planning, or also technology or training needs. Next slide, please. So Sunshine mentioned the Community Impact Grant Program. So that's been around for about 8 years. And as he mentioned, they received a really large allocation, $250,000, to help with the site planning and resident engagement for the Kendallwood project. And so the three things that you see on the screen here are really the buckets that we use the Community Impact Grant Program. Planning aspects, as far as development, we have a deconstruction grant, which can be used for demolition to demolish a building that would be built, a new construction project at a larger scale, and then a stabilization grant that can be used to stabilize a particular building that is then going to be turned into affordable housing. And then the last, I'll just briefly touch on our innovation grant. We have not funded this every year, but we're interested in innovative ways of kind of bringing down the cost of construction. We're also now focusing on innovative ways of program delivery, and some outcomes that have come from the innovation grant were the first owner-occupied 3D printed home in the country down in James City County through a Habitat chapter. And then a nonprofit here in Richmond has been working on developing the next generation of manufactured homes. The program has kind of evolved over the past few years. We have changed the funding so that those large block grants really are not available anymore. It's more specific. And if you'll go to the next slide, I'll talk specifically about the planning aspects. So nonprofits in this program, the Community Impact Grant Program, are for nonprofits, local governments, housing authorities. In Virginia, we have regional planning organizations called planning district commissions, and they are all eligible for this type of funding. So it can be used for due diligence activities, site planning, feasibility studies, preliminary A&E work, but also regional market assessments or local market assessments. We funded a planning district commission housing development grant 2 years ago that to allow planning districts to kind of focus on their specific needs as it relates to affordable housing. And so a lot of those PDCs have come into us for regional market assessments to kind of help guide their decision making with the PDC grant. The applications are structured so that each study is up to $20,000, but they can be combined into one application. So, you know, if it was a habitat chapter, they could come in for a site plan, a preliminary A&E report, and a feasibility study and get up to $60,000. So next slide, please. As far as what we're here to talk about today is community engagement. We have a community engagement grant that can go up to $50,000 that can really pay for consultant costs to help with community engagement. So we have these 3 buckets of funding here that you see on the screen. Community input sessions are meetings, you know, that are really designed to gather feedback from your constituents who are going to be affected by the potential project. So charrettes, things like that. We've seen surveys, other types of activities to engage the residents to kind of help you know, drive decision making on the project. The neighborhood community planning bucket is really focused on a specific land use proposal that maybe will inform rezoning or other land use strategies that are going to support affordable housing development. And then with this fiscal year that we just rolled out in July, we have an affordable housing awareness grant, which are marketing efforts aimed at to educate and inform the community about the benefits of incorporating affordable housing into the community and some potential strategies for implementation. Next slide, please. So one specific example that I just want to highlight is in the city of Alexandria, which was the South Patrick Street housing affordability strategy. And so the activities that you see there were the specific you know, engagement activities, but what this was really tied to where there were 2 affordable housing projects that were in danger of losing their HUD contract. It was over 200 units along the Route 1 corridor in Alexandria. And so the city applied to us for a community impact grant, and they worked with community and commercial property owners to develop strategies and public and private resources to preserve affordability and diversity. It also explored strategies to strengthen the character of the neighborhood, prioritize safety along Route 1 South, and create a more welcoming gateway into the city. Next slide, please. So the results of this planning activity were that the city created the strategy as an amendment to their small area plan for that part of the city. And they created a residential multifamily zone, which was a new zoning tool that incentivized the enhancement and preservation of the long-term affordable projects through the provision of additional density. And so this approach through the city was awarded an award from the National ULI for the best housing policy in 2021. Next slide. And then just before I hand it off to Phil, just a couple of more recent examples of community engagement grants in the Allegheny Highlands part of Virginia in the town of Clifton Forge. The town applied to us for an architectural report for a vacant school, and then did some community engagement about revisioning of what the school could be used for affordable housing and community purposes. In the city of Roanoke in Western Virginia, they did some site planning and then conducted some focus groups to help develop an ordinance around the cottage court development. And then the New River Valley Regional Commission is a planning district commission in the town of Blacksburg and in the New River Valley region, where they have used our PDC grant to develop a housing trust fund. And so they use the engagement grant to build a communication strategy to get support for the Regional Housing Trust Fund. And that kind of led us to create this new funding category for the Affordable Housing Awareness category. So I'm going to pass this on over to my colleague, Phil.
Great. Thank you, Luke. And we can do the next slide. Really don't have a lot more to say other than from what Luke and Sunshine have already said. But yeah, my name is Phil Cunningham. I'm a tax credit allocation officer at Virginia Housing and the de facto IRA point guy. So, you know, kind of to Sunshine's point of Virginia Housing really trying to create an environment that enables our developer partners to engage with residents and kind of plan for IRA projects specifically. Another aspect at Virginia Housing is that we have multiple committees or councils, including a rental advisory council, which Sunshine is a part of. And so, you know, over the past year or so, we've been doing these regular kind of updates and just sort of info sessions about the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the different funding sources available to help kind of get our development partners thinking about these different sources and how to incorporate them. You know, Sunshine really said it best about, you know, getting residents and neighbors involved as a point of agency for them, and that they're really able to be involved in their own future and the future of their homes. And so I think for owners, this is a really good way to think about, you know, reducing turnover. You know, if we want to kind of talk in business terms, how to reduce turnover and lengthen resident stays. And if it's an existing building, you know, maybe it's also a chance to identify kind of discrete maintenance or asset management needs as you're going through some of these surveys and engagement sessions with residents. With the IRA, I know there's been a lot of discussion about not wanting to kind of recreate the wheel or do too many new things, but figure out how to incorporate existing tools and existing processes and maybe just kind of make it a little more green. So I think, you know, that's another way to think about resident engagement, is that this is really just a part of property needs assessment as well. You know, asking residents what are their current challenges and what are their priorities for the future. Is it high utility bills? Is that kind of the main thing? And how does that open up into either broader discussions or maybe really technical things like usability of certain systems like a thermostat. You know, if we're talking programmable thermostats, Nest versus, you know, digital thermostats versus not, water pressure, green space, you know, things of that nature. Is it, you know, what do the residents value? Is it kind of this general sense of being a green building or sustainable community? Is it solar panels specifically? Again, maybe more specific things like high energy or high efficiency washer and dryers, LED lighting, all kind of those little things that make up the scope of work in a project. Does electric vehicle charging make sense? Maybe is that something you phase into the future? All these sorts of things that IRA funding can go towards, and how do you really get the most impact for the residents? And again, I think as Virginia Housing and our state HFA, really wanting to be a good partner and helping our development team collaborate. You know, we have a lot of resources, but we know we don't have them all. But we do like to try to help connect folks, whether that's with the state and localities, or other developers or other lending partners to help reach the goal. Additionally, I guess one last note I had here was thinking about, you know, especially with the Justice 40 initiative and other, you know, Section 3 goals, are there residents at your communities that have connections to small businesses, whether their own or a friend or family in the community that could be in that subcontractor pool? or what kind of like workforce training opportunities are there to help, again, engage residents and their networks to, take advantage of the capital coming into the project. So that's really all I have, and I'll bump it back to Danielle, and happy to take any questions.
Actually, I think we're hitting it back over to Madeline. We're just going to talk a little bit about one of our projects.
We do have one question for Sunshine that I want to make sure we get answered before we hit 3. Someone asked about the energy savings that were passed on to tenants through this work. Was it just energy bill decreases, or was there other benefits for tenants in terms of energy savings?
Well, energy bill reductions are the primary way to pass on those savings for sure. We are in our, as you know, in a like sort of LIHTC funded project, you have utility allowances. And so what we have done with our utility allowances is been conservative in our assumptions, so that meaning that we are expecting more savings than we actually are claiming on the utility allowances to allow residents to fundamentally benefit. And then beyond that, the roofs will be covered in solar, and we are master metering the buildings, so that, and then privately submetering each individual unit. So the solar will go directly into that meter, which will then have directly offset and reduce resident utility bills through their sort of sub-meter process. And so the residents will actually see that direct savings from the solar as well. We don't, it's all based on energy modeling and assumptions, so we'll see how it plays out over the first year when we start to see what the data shows. But I am hoping that, for a 1-bedroom apartment someone who's conservative, they might be pretty darn close to net zero. These are 4-story buildings, so even pushing the envelope on energy efficiency with solar, it's hard to get to net zero across the entire building. But for 1-bedroom apartments, I'm hoping that they will be pretty darn close. But we should see, at least 50 to 60% reductions compared to what they're paying now.
Awesome. And then there's a follow-up question to that. No decreases to the rent with the decreases to utility allowances, or how is that relationship working?
So that's why we talked about being conservative around the utility allowance assumptions, essentially to give. I mean, one way we could do it, of course, is like, okay, let's energy model it, assume they're the average or the average renter is going to save whatever $75 a month in utility costs, and then raise the rent by $75. Like that's the typical way of doing it. What we're trying to do instead, these aren't exact numbers, but so the principle behind it is, instead of assuming that those residents are going to save 75, instead assume they're going to save 35 or 37.50. So we will raise the rent a little bit on the other side to counterbalance, but there will be overall additional savings when you add the two together.
Got it. Thank you. So going off of a lot of what Phil and Luke and Sunshine were saying is that, we have funding that might come from your HFA and your state to support this type of work, but there's also funding in other places that can really be used to help leverage you getting funding through the IRA. So DC's Department of Energy and Environment is looking to revamp their climate goals, expand on those. And to do that, they want to make sure from the beginning that they're hearing from residents, especially residents from historically marginalized communities that aren't often included in these conversations, that bear the biggest brunt of climate change. And so through that, NHT has received funding from DOEE to lead an equitable electrification pilot program. So we are doing this at 2 of our properties. One in Northwest, it's a LIHTC property, predominantly Latinx Spanish-speaking residents. And then our second property is a co-op in Southeast DC. It is predominantly Black residents. So we realized that electrification, energy efficiency, this type of issues aren't the biggest issues for our residents. There's more important things to them. So we wanted to introduce this topic to our residents and get them talking about it on kind of a high level at the beginning, and then going in deeper. So we hosted what we call Power on the Block events. And this is where we invite a number of organizations that are already existing partners at our properties to come and kind of have a block party. Music, games, food. We invited the DC Public Libraries, family support organizations, food security groups, utility assistance. There's opportunities for residents to sign up for utility assistance at these events, all kinds of activities. And through what you see in the right-hand picture is these like interactive ways that residents can begin thinking about electrification, decarbonization, energy efficiency, not only how this affects like climate change, but also impacts their daily lives. So we had interactive games, we had fun flyers and information briefs they could take home. But we also had residents sign up for small group discussions. And so about 6 to 8 weeks after the Power in the Block event, we contacted the residents that said they were interested in participating in small group discussions. And we hosted these in the evenings at the property with support from DOEE and community-based organizations that are either leading community engagement work already or doing electrification work with residents in the district. And we kind of started to dive in deep on what electrification is and what this means for our residents. So this was an opportunity for them to voice, concerns, ask questions, share thoughts about what this could mean for them, so that when DOEE begins to write these goals, they're prioritizing our residents' priorities and concerns in this work. So not only is this going to help DOEE, but it's also going to help the property as, like Phil was saying, as we begin to go through property assessments of what work needs to be done, we're aware of what our residents deem important. Like Sunshine said, a big thing is utility costs. Residents don't want their costs to go up. We heard from residents the importance of having backup power, because when you switch to electric, if the power goes out, what's the risk? Safety, removing gas appliances in homes, especially if young kids in the house, all those things. And also just making sure that, as DOEE does this work, it's being done in an equitable way. And we've been getting really great feedback and engagement from our residents at our first 2 sessions. We have a third one this evening at our Northwest property. And it really is an opportunity for residents to not only learn about this information, but also be able to have a voice and an impact in the work that's being done in the district. So that's another way that folks can engage with residents outside of, the property specific work.
And I'll just add a word to that. And I want to give Madeline a lot of credit along with her peers for leading this work. It's a fantastic project that's going really well. And it really is helping us as NHT both gain insights into what it means to do effective resident engagement around IRA programming, but also helps us begin to equip ourselves with the tools and the capacity and the understanding of how to do this work when we go about implementing our GERP grants or, undertaking the next recapitalization, whether or not that's got federal funds in it, so that we can make it as sustainable and resilient as possible. So we're learning a lot in the process, and think it's going to pay dividends in many, many ways.
Yeah, definitely. And the residents said too, they just like being included. They like having a say and a voice in the work that the government is doing. So we are coming to an end of our boot camp sessions. We're going to be wrapping up at the end of this year. So this is just a schedule for our next few sessions that we have. Some are joint, some are just HFA or developer specific. But they're covering a variety of topics. So in November, we're going to be talking about data management and benchmarking. A lot of the IRA programming has data collection and benchmarking requirements. So we just want to talk through what this looks like, ways to track, support that's needed. We'll have a few different folks joining the call to speak, including New Ecology, who's leading our TA portion of the boot camp. And then for HFAs at the end of the month, we'll be talking about how to integrate IRA funding with a different programs. In December, we will be working with our developers to take the scopes of work that New Ecology has developed for you all, and then kind of draw lines and connect to what IRA funding can support this work. Again, if you don't have the scope of work because you're participating in a second round, this is still a really useful session, because when you have that scope of work in the new year, you can look back on this session and these notes to figure out what funding can support that. And then on the 13th for the HFAs, we'll be going in talking about DOE rebates and what that might look like in your state and the role you're playing with your state energy office. And throughout this process, or throughout this timeline from November into the new year, our developers will be having cohort sessions and one-on-one meetings with New Ecology to finalize those scopes of work and identify funding through the IRA. So these session invites will be sent out later this week, but we do have a little bit of time in case anyone has questions for Sunshine or Phil or Luke. Or if anyone else wants to briefly share any resident engagement successes they've had at their properties or in their state.
Hello, this is Tony Avant, Rhode Island Housing. Can you hear me? I do have one question. There was a question. The architect was talking about how they got around getting benefits back to the tenant, and they were doing a master meter system and sub metering back to the tenants. In Rhode Island, if you have over 10 units, you're not allowed to have a master meter. I ran into this issue recently, and we did get one type of sub meter approved, but that's been a big barrier in our state. And I'm just curious how the Virginia folks got around it. Is there a similar law on the books in Virginia?
Yeah, just quickly, it is a state by state decision. When I worked in Texas prior to being in Virginia, and we could not do that there. We had a similar condition to what you have. But Virginia, the code is different, so it allows for it. So it is a sort of a state by state opportunity.
Yeah. We're trying to get that changed now, and we did find a type of sub meter that the utility company approved. So we'll use that as a model going forward, but it wasn't easy. You know? Okay.
Thanks. Seema, I see you have your hand raised.
Hi, thank you so much for these presentations. I have a question that I'm trying to grapple with, and hopefully more voices will help me answer that question. We've been trying to do some outreach for the IRA programs, and now we have a competitive 9% round coming up in January. So we are beginning the pre-applications, and our applicants are wanting to include, ITC tax credits, 45L tax credits into their sources. What are you asking them in terms of requirements? What should we be asking? Give us an idea of the cost that would be like solar related cost or eligible cost under these, or how do we make sure that we don't land ourselves into a gap once the awards are made? Any suggestions?
If folks can't, oh, sorry, I was just going to say, if that's a common question that other agencies are running into, we can make sure we flag it for the November 29th session when we're talking about leveraging the financing. Not sure if anyone else has been running into this in their state.
Yeah, or even how other states are thinking about that if you're starting to, put new policies in place as well.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer yet either, but we always like to see any documentation for, 45L and the ITC, it's another tax credit. So we kind of just see that it's up to their counsel and their accountants to make sure that it's real at 8609. So we require all this final source documentation at project closeout, but it's difficult and definitely something looking forward to continuing that conversation.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, at 8609, we'll know the complete picture, but because it's a competitive round and you're letting them include it into the capital stack, not knowing that they would get it in the end. We're looking, what else could we ask for? We're asking their energy consultant to give us, all right, how are you meeting these credits? What is the number? Do the numbers make sense in terms of the ITCs? Besides that, I think we couldn't come up with anything much more at this, application stage. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Seema.
This is Sunshine. Just quickly, I'll just share that one of my experience with Virginia housing is that over the last few years, sort of separate from IRA specifically, but in general around sustainability, as the Virginia housing was looking at integrating more and more sustainability either incentives or requirements, depending on the context. In the QAP, they did a really good job of pulling together stakeholders from the developer side, which included both developers, but also those, building design experts, architects, etc., and worked together to actually draft the language that made the most sense, both from the Virginia Housing's perspective, but also from the developer side. So for what that's worth. I know it's a little late in the sequence for what you're talking about, Seema, but as a sort of a future-looking mechanism.
Thank you, Sunshine. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Nope. Okay. If anything pops up, feel free to email me. Everyone should have my contact. We'll be sending out the resources from today's session by the end of the week. For our HFAs, we'll have those copy and paste resources and some additional resources that HFAs mentioned during Sunday's session sent out as soon as they're finalized. And then for our developers, be on the lookout for the cohort session invite and the one-on-one meetings with New Ecology. But that is all. Everyone have a good rest of your day. Thanks for hopping on.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to our speakers particularly. Thank you. Bye.